Hi everyone, you're welcome. Today is the day the Lord has made. We rejoice and we're glad in it. I'm going to be talking about the subject on obedience. Obedience in a nutshell is simply to hear an instruction and to do it. Hear an instruction and follow through with it. It takes me to the story of Abraham in the book of Genesis, where God told Abraham to go and sacrifice his son, his beloved son Isaac. And straight away the Bible records to us that Abraham got up the next morning and he packed everything that he required for the sacrifice, and he went on his journey with Isaac, his servants, and they packed what they needed to pack. Now that is a perfect example of obedience. And that kind of obedience got Abraham the reputation that he now has on a global basis. We all know that Abraham eventually became the father of all the Israelites. And then he also became Father Abraham for those of us who are connected through Jesus Christ as Christians all over the world. Now, that's an example of one man who just obeyed. Now, there are different kinds of obedience, and that's what I want to touch on today. We know from what Abraham did, immediately he packed and he left. So his obedience was an immediate obedience. His kind of obedience was on point, and it's the kind of perfect obedience that God requires from every one of us when he gives us an instruction. There is another kind of obedience that I will call the partial obedience. For an example, Abraham could have said, okay, yes, we'll go and do the sacrifice. But instead of sacrificing Isaac, he could have just decided, I'll sacrifice Isaac, I will go ahead, but it'll be partial. So there will be a sacrifice, but I'm not ready to get rid of my son. I cannot part with my begotten son. So instead of that, I'll obey God. At least he'll get a sacrifice. However, he won't get the 100% sacrifice that he wanted. But with partial obedience isn't really obedience in the eyes of God. You might as well call that disobedience, because who needed to be sacrificed was Isaac, and not a substitute son or substitute servants or ordinary other human beings. So we see that Abraham in that position obeyed, and he did full obedience, and it was not partial obedience. Now, another kind of obedience is the delayed obedience. Abraham could have just said, okay, well, I'm going to have a send-off party for Isaac. And rather than go ahead the next day and obey that instruction as promptly and swiftly as God had given it to him, he could have decided, I'm going to do a little send-off for Isaac. We're going to take some time, some final bonding time. Nothing prepared me for this instruction that God gave. This is a very big sacrifice. Lord, how does he want? I'm going to obey, but just give me some time. Let's all kiss Isaac goodbye. Let us all say our, final farewells to him, and then we'll go our merry way. That would have been delayed obedience. Now, delayed obedience is not the kind of obedience that God requires. Because when God asks us to do anything, he goes to seek what's in our heart. Are we going to obey him fully? Are we going to obey him immediately? Or are we going to delay the obedience? There's another kind of obedience. It's called the sacrificial obedience. It's the part where you say, well, Abraham could have said, well, God wanted just one person. Okay, I'm not going to sacrifice Isaac. However, I can sacrifice my other son. I can sacrifice 4 of my choicest servants in my household. That way I would have sacrificed 5 people to God instead of 1. Now that would have been sacrificial sacrifice. Okay? However, that's not what God wanted. God wanted the one instruction. He didn't want you to replace that one by sacrificing more people. So, and then there's a final one, which is the unwilling obedience. That's the one we do usually. Most of us are guilty of that. We do it grudgingly, we do it grumpily, we have an attitude. We still do it eventually, but we do it like we don't get it. What's God thinking? What was on God's mind? I mean, really? Sometimes God doesn't know when to stop. You know, that kind of attitude that we can sometimes have. Abraham didn't have delayed obedience. He didn't have partial obedience, and he didn't have sacrificial obedience. Neither did he have unwilling obedience. The book of Isaiah says that if we are willing and we are obedient, we shall eat the good of the land. And I believe that can be said of every one of us if we go about obedience to godly instruction with this attitude. Let's be willing, let's be prompt, let's not be partial, and let's not have a scheme and a replacement. God is all wise. At the end of every instruction, He's got a benefit, He's got a reward for us. And just like Abraham, if we are willing and obedient, we'll eat the good of the land. Now, everyone knows Abraham. His name's written in the Bible. Abraham's gone on to become the father of many nations. Now, I don't know what your instruction is today, but there's some of us, God instructed you a year ago, you still haven't obeyed. Some of us received an instruction a week ago, and we're still pushing it forward. You know, whether you delay it or you don't, there is a reward for it. Another angle that I'd like to come out with from that same story of Father Abraham is the angle of trust. Many times, a lot of us are unable to follow through in obedience to God and godly instruction, simply because we do not understand what God has on His mind. We do not understand what God is trying to achieve. And that creates an element of mistrust. Many of us are unable to move forward because we can't decipher what is going on. But I'd like to give you a practical angle to it, to say that if we can bring in the element of trust, it becomes very easy to walk in obedience to God. So on the basis of his trust for God, he was able to move and moved promptly. He was able to move and move perfectly. He was able to move without shifting to the left or shifting to the right. Now, the beautiful thing about Abraham's instruction is when Abraham proceeded, when he had gotten to the mountain, he told the servants, "You guys should wait yonder. I and the lad will go up and do the sacrifice." Now, along the way at the sacrifice, Isaac asks his father and says, "I can see the wood. I can see all the things that will be required. But my father, where is the animal for sacrifice?" And Abraham said, "God is able to provide." Now, at the very final hour, when Isaac was supposed to have been sacrificed, God called Abraham and said, "Do not sacrifice your son, your precious son. Behind the thicket, I have provided a ram." So the real point for today is to say, if you can be willing and obedient, just be prepared to trust God. Trust him, saying, he is faithful who promised he will deliver. How he delivers, we don't know. However, trust God that he will always have a ram ready for you at the final hour. And on that note, it becomes very easy and simplified to obey God. Once you've made certain that you've heard from Him, yours is to be willing and obedient and follow through. I can guarantee you, just like Abraham, there'll be a ram waiting at the top of the mountain.